Richard Westbrook had never been one to shy away from a challenge. The tech mogul-turned-investor had built his fortune from the ground up, each move calculated with precision, each decision backed by cold, hard data. Now, in his late 40s, with millions in the bank and an empire at his feet, he had set his sights on something new. Real estate. When Richard heard about the remote swamp land up for grabs at a ridiculously low price, his instincts screamed, opportunity. A piece of property worth next to nothing, sitting on the outskirts of nowhere. Most investors dismissed it as useless, a quagmire of marshy land, tangled with overgrowth and home to little more than wild animals. But to Richard, it was a diamond in the rough. The locals whispered about the swamp, but their stories only fueled his curiosity. They spoke of it as if it were cursed, warning that the land was not to be trifled with. The wild horses that roamed the swamp were legends, they said, untamable, wild, and fiercely protective of their domain. But Richard didn't buy into superstition. To him, those whispers were nothing more than folklore, the kind of chatter that kept the unambitious in their place. A bargain, pure and simple. The swamp cost him pennies compared to what it could yield in development. Richard saw only the potential, a sprawling luxury resort, a sanctuary for the wealthy, a retreat where the elite could escape the chaos of the city. He could transform it, make it a hotspot, turn a profit, and no one would stand in his way. Little did he know, the swamp held secrets far older than his ambition. Secrets it wasn't ready to share. And soon, Richard would learn that some bargains are too good to be true. Richard Westbrook had always been a man who saw opportunities where others saw obstacles. When he purchased the swampland, the deal felt like a stroke of genius. He signed the paperwork with a smile, fully expecting the land to transform from something neglected and undervalued into a luxurious destination for the wealthy. In his mind, this was going to be his crowning achievement, a project that would put his name in the real estate history books. The swamp, with its dense undergrowth and winding waterways, wasn't much to look at. The land appeared barren, too swampy, too isolated, too wild. But Richard knew better. A few bulldozers and excavation crews, a little landscaping, and a touch of luxury could change everything. He envisioned a sprawling resort with villas perched above the mist, fine dining nestled in the trees, and a spa built into the heart of the swamp itself. The idea alone was enough to excite him. The price was what sealed the deal. Richard couldn't believe his luck. The land had been up for auction for months, and yet no one had bid on it. At first, the real estate agents had looked at him strangely when he expressed interest. "Are you sure about this one, Mr. Westbrook?" they'd asked. "It's swampland. There's no demand. There's nothing there." But that was precisely why Richard had jumped on it. It was an untouched canvas, a chance to mold something unique. 4 pennies on the dollar, he was about to own hundreds of acres of land that could become the next great luxury escape. His competitors had overlooked it, but Richard knew he had the vision and resources to make it work. It was the kind of move that had made him a billionaire in the first place. But from the moment the papers were signed, things began to feel off. It started with the locals. They were cautious when Richard began making plans to clear the land. There was a palpable unease whenever he passed through town, a mix of distrust and old-fashioned wariness. The elderly farmers and fishermen muttered warnings under their breath whenever he came into the local diner, their eyes shadowed with suspicion. "That land's cursed," one old man had told him, a glint of something unspoken in his eyes. "You're tampering with something you don't understand." Richard had chuckled at the man's words. Cursed, he'd thought. There's no such thing. He pressed on, ignoring the chatter. As construction crews arrived to begin clearing the land, Richard felt a growing sense of irritation at what he perceived as the backward thinking of the locals. They were stuck in the past, unwilling to see the future. After all, they didn't have the vision, the resources, or the ambition to make something of that land. Richard did. And then there were the horses. At first, they seemed like nothing more than a curious inconvenience, wild, untamed creatures that roamed the edges of the land. Richard had seen a few from his office window, grazing by the riverbank, their powerful forms cutting through the mist like shadows. But he didn't pay them much mind. "They're just horses," he thought. "They'll move on once we start work." But they didn't move. Instead, they began to appear more frequently, standing at the edges of his construction sites, watching. As if they were waiting for something. It was then that Richard first started hearing the strange reports from his workers. "The horses, they're tearing down the fences," one reported. "And we lost a few tools. Someone's messing with the equipment." Richard brushed it off. Maybe it was a prank, maybe some local kids trying to cause trouble. But each report grew stranger, more unsettling. The horses weren't just watching. They were interfering. They were somehow fighting back. And they weren't alone. By the time the first major incident occurred, Richard knew something was wrong. He'd ordered the crew to build a road that would cut through the thickest part of the swamp, but when they arrived the next morning, the machinery was gone. No signs of struggle. No traces of vandalism. Just gone. As if the land itself had swallowed it up. Richard stood there, staring at the empty space where the equipment had been. His stomach churned. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and for the first time, he felt something he hadn't in years: doubt. The deal that seemed too good to be true was beginning to unravel, and Richard didn't know why, or how, it was happening. The swamp, the horses, and the land itself were becoming something more than just an inconvenience. They were fighting back. The day Richard Westbrook realized the land was no longer his to control began like any other, with a hum of construction machines and the chatter of workers. But something was different. The air felt heavy, almost charged, as if the swamp itself was holding its breath. It started with small disruptions: tools missing, equipment slightly damaged, and workers uneasy. At first, Richard thought it was nothing more than human error or perhaps sabotage from disgruntled employees. But as the days went on, the incidents grew more frequent, and their nature more disturbing. The heavy machinery that had been left in the swamp overnight would often be found in a different spot the next morning. No tracks in the mud. No signs of human intervention. Just machinery that had been moved. Then came the first real shock. One morning, the construction team arrived to find the fence they had spent days building torn down, as though it had been shredded by something massive. The posts had been ripped out of the ground, the wires snapped, scattered in every direction. "It was the horses," one of the workers muttered, his voice trembling. He had seen them, standing in the distance, watching. Richard shook his head, dismissing the notion. "Horses can't do this," he thought. "This is nonsense." But as the days wore on, the incidents grew harder to ignore. The horses were no longer content with staying at the edge of the construction site. They were circling, always at the periphery, their eyes trained on the workers. Every time a crew member stepped into the swamp, the horses followed, their movements eerily synchronized. The most unsettling part was the silence. They never neighed or charged, they just stood there, observing, waiting. It was as if they were making a calculated decision, understanding the stakes better than any of Richard's human workers. They moved like shadows, appearing and disappearing with the mist, leaving behind a trail of destruction. The war, Richard realized, had begun, and it wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet, stealthy, and disorienting. That night, Richard stayed at the site, determined to catch whoever, or whatever, was sabotaging his plans. He set up surveillance cameras and hired additional security. But when the sun rose the next morning, he found that the cameras had been disabled, and once again, the machines had vanished. In the distance, the wild horses stood at the edge of the swamp, watching, as if waiting for him to make the next move. This was no longer just a simple land dispute. Richard was locked in a silent war, one that he had no idea how to win. Richard Westbrook had built his fortune by outthinking his competitors, by pushing boundaries others didn't dare to. In every business deal, he was the one with the edge, always a step ahead, always in control. But here, in the depths of the swamp, he found himself powerless. The land that had seemed like such a brilliant opportunity had turned into a labyrinth of frustration and failure. The wild horses were no longer just an inconvenience, they were a direct challenge to his authority. The construction site, once a symbol of his vision, now felt like a battlefield. Every time Richard thought he had regained control, the horses struck back. Tools went missing. Fences were torn down. Equipment was dismantled. The workers' fear was palpable. They no longer came to work with their usual enthusiasm. They came with reluctance and unease, casting nervous glances at the woods and the water. No one could explain how the horses were managing to outsmart them, but everyone felt the unease growing. At first, Richard had believed that the workers were just scared of the wild animals. But as the incidents became more brazen, his doubts started to creep in. The horses weren't just disrupting the work, they were actively sabotaging it. It wasn't just about moving equipment or breaking fences, it was about undermining his entire vision for the land. His frustration began to seep into everything he did. He would pace the length of the construction site, watching as his plans unraveled bit by bit. This is just a land grab, a matter of resources, he reminded himself, trying to maintain control. But the feeling of being trapped, of being outmatched by animals, gnawed at him. This was supposed to be his triumph, his legacy. Now, he was stuck, fighting against forces he couldn't understand. It's just horses, he told himself, though his voice had started to falter. To combat the mounting pressure, Richard brought in more security. He ordered a higher fence, hired more guards, and set up state-of-the-art surveillance systems. He threw money at the problem, confident that his resources would ultimately give him the edge. But the horses seemed to have a sixth sense. They knew where the cameras were, and they would vanish before anyone could catch them. The high-tech equipment, the surveillance teams, the fences, they all became part of the never-ending game, but Richard was losing. The swamp, and the creatures within it, were far more resourceful than he had ever anticipated. His obsession grew. He spent sleepless nights poring over maps of the swamp, charting the horses' movements, trying to decipher their patterns. But there was no rhyme or reason to their actions, only unpredictability. The horses would strike at odd hours, and then disappear, leaving behind only chaos. Richard's nights became restless. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his mind racing. He felt like he was being hunted, like the very land was conspiring against him. The strain began to take its toll on Richard's relationships. His phone calls with business partners became more curt, more defensive. His once energetic vision for the project had become a desperate need to win, to prove that he was right, that he wasn't being outplayed by a herd of wild horses. His ambition, once his greatest strength, had now become his Achilles' heel. He could feel the weight of his failure looming over him, but the harder he fought, the more elusive victory seemed. "They can't keep winning," he muttered to himself, pacing again, unable to sit still. "I won't let them." But deep down, Richard knew, he was already losing. And he had no idea how to stop it. Richard Westbrook was no stranger to battles. In the boardrooms of high-powered meetings, he had crushed competitors with a single decision, a calculated move that left no room for doubt. But here, in the heart of the swamp, the rules were different. No matter how much money he threw at the problem, no matter how many men he brought in, he couldn't get a handle on the situation. The wild horses had become more than a nuisance. They were a force of nature, and they had outwitted him at every turn. But Richard, ever stubborn, was determined to fight back. He'd been humiliated too many times, and this time he would win. He decided to go all in, bring in the best trackers, the best hunters, and capture the stallion leading the herd. If he could take down the leader, Richard was certain the rest of the horses would fall in line. The herd would break, the swamp would be his, and the project would go forward as planned. Richard's team set up camp deep within the swamp, their eyes focused on the stallion. For days, they tracked the horses, following their elusive hoofprints and watching their movements from afar. The stallion, a majestic creature with a coat as black as midnight, was always just out of reach, appearing for moments and then vanishing into the shadows of the trees. It was as if he knew they were coming, evading them at every turn, guiding the herd in ways that seemed almost unnatural. The tension built to a fever pitch. Richard could feel it in his bones, the anticipation, the overwhelming desire to conquer. "I'll get him," he told himself, staring at the silhouette of the stallion in the distance. "I'll make them see who's in charge." But when the moment came, when Richard and his team made their move, everything went wrong. The horses had anticipated it. As they made their approach, the stallion led them straight into a dense patch of swamp, where the thick underbrush and shallow waters turned the terrain into a maze of traps. The men's movements became slow and labored, their boots sinking into the muck, while the horses danced around them effortlessly. The stallion, a creature of strategy, led the hunters deeper into the swamp, only to vanish into the mist just as they got close. Then, the trap was sprung. Suddenly, the herd appeared from all directions, surrounding the men in perfect formation, a wall of wild, untamed fury. But there was no charge, no frantic attack. The horses simply stood, their presence suffocating, their eyes locked on the humans. They were silent, their message clear: This land is not yours." Richard's team was disoriented, their energy drained. The horses hadn't fought with force, they had fought with intelligence, leading the humans into a labyrinth they couldn't escape. Every time Richard thought he had them cornered, they outwitted him. This was no battle of strength, it was a battle of strategy. As the horses receded into the swamp, leaving Richard and his team to retreat in defeat, it became painfully clear to Richard, the horses had won. The defeat hit Richard harder than he had imagined. Staring at the empty swamp, the echoes of his retreating team reverberated in his mind. The silent, deliberate tactics of the horses had exposed a brutal truth. He was not in control. It wasn't the first time he had lost a battle, but this felt different. This felt like a reckoning. In the days that followed, Richard couldn't shake the image of the horses standing still, watching, calculating. They weren't mindless animals, they were guardians. The swamp, their domain, was a sanctuary they would not surrender, not for wealth or ambition. Richard had come to exploit the land, but he realized that some things weren't meant to be owned. The land had its own rhythm, its own guardianship, and he had underestimated it all. A part of him wanted to press on, to fight back harder. But another part of him, quieter and more reflective, understood that this war wasn't his to win. It was their land, their home, and he had invaded it with nothing but greed. Richard withdrew from the project, the grand resort idea abandoned. He didn't walk away as a conqueror, but as a man who had learned the hard way that some forces couldn't be controlled, only respected. Richard Westbrook never returned to the swamp. The plans for his luxury resort remained unfinished, a ghostly reminder of his failed ambition. Over time, the land healed, as the wild horses continued to roam the mist-covered waters, their presence undisturbed. The locals, once skeptical, now spoke of the horses with newfound reverence, recognizing them not just as animals, but as protectors, guardians of a legacy that was older and more powerful than Richard's fleeting dreams. The swamp, untouched and alive, became a symbol of nature's resilience, standing firm against human greed. Richard's defeat was silent, but it was complete. The horses hadn't charged or fought, they had simply waited, outlasting the human force that had tried to claim their world. In the end, the wild horses didn't need to speak. Their victory was as quiet and powerful as the land they protected, a victory that resonated far beyond the swamp.